And so welcome again to our weekly call. Good to have everyone on. If I just share my screen, which I gathered from comments last week, the different format wasn't as easy for people that were joining remotely, even though the recording looked fine. So I'll go back to what I did previously, which hopefully is easier for you to see everything on the screen. So in terms of our agenda, we will be talking about NIS2. Michael had an early flight this morning. He is in a car heading to somewhere where he can connect. So sometime between 15:15 and 25 past the hour, I'm expecting to see him on. So we'll do some other updates first, and then I'll hand off to Michael as he arrives onto the call. So if he's arrived and I haven't noticed, please someone interrupt me and let me know, and then we'll hand off to him. But he's hopefully sort of 10 minutes or so away from not having to do this from his mobile, which would be harder. So Michael will give us an update. We'll revisit sort of NIS2, following on from his presentation on the same topic earlier in the year. And around that, so a little bit before he joins, and then afterwards, I'll talk about some of the sort of news of the last week or so, and then we'll, sort of time permitting, fit in some stuff around forthcoming events, etc. So that's the plan. As I say, albeit that I'll do some of the news headlines now and then stop as and when I see Michael join the call. And there was quite a lot in the news over the last week or so. As always, if you didn't catch if you're not on my sort of news headlines mailing list and would like to be, just message me or ping me an email, and I'll be happy to add you to the list. But I just call out some of the headlines. What I should also have said, which is very rude to me, thanks to DNS for sponsoring this call, the sort of long-term sponsor of the call. So really appreciate their support as part of what they do for the sort of DNS community more generally. Right, okay, so just touching on some of the headlines, things that caught my eye over the last week or so. Was an interesting article, Michael Smith at Vacara just did a piece on protective DNS, specifically countrywide protective DNS. So the sort of thing that, for example, I think is deployed in Canada, with CIRA, in the US, certainly for federal employees, through I think an Accenture Cloudflare consortium, in the UK as well, again for government employees, or I think that's going to open up soon to schools, but hasn't done so yet, and various other countries. So seems to be a trend that's growing, and obviously perhaps not quite country specific, but more on a regional basis. The sort of DNS for EU initiative sort of fits in that same space, and he talks through some of the advantages, some of the challenges around deployment. I think, for example, on threat analysis, threat identification being one of the advantages, because it's country specific rather than relying on more generic threat feeds that are used by many of the different resolvers. So yeah, I thought that was interesting, but worth a look. I won't go through, as always, all of these. There's some stuff from Echo from their Dot magazine about securely operating authoritative name servers, etc. piece, quite an interesting piece in Medium from Kyoto Tech, who I'll confess I hadn't come across Kyoto previously. Probably my ignorance, probably very well known in their niche, but they were making, on the whole, a positive case for encrypted client hello. That's the extension to TLS 1.3 we've talked about a few times on this call. It's an interesting article in as much as it sort of set out both sort of the technical details, but also some of in there are some of the limitations of the proposed standard. So I thought it was pretty balanced. Quite a useful article. Other things, also talking about ECH, Fortinet's Fortios, there were some release notes for the latest version of that, which again talked about ECH, specifically more about options that they can use to either block or allow ECH and other types of sort of TLS connections, as you can see from my sort of summary, by modifying DOE responses in different ways. So I think that's in the context potentially of a enterprise type environment. Kathleen, I think your hand is raised. Did you want to jump in on something?
Yes, on the ECH piece. So for your awareness, another blog of mine should come out soon, and it was similarly aimed at schools. Paul Vixie is one of the reviewers, and Brian Haberman, plus a couple of others that didn't want to be named for obvious reasons. Censorship being one of the tricky pieces. So I sent it to RSA conference on Friday, and then I saw you post this particular blog. It has a different theme, and it's because I have an 8.5-year-old. It's more direct in terms of what schools can do, but it is also aimed at, oh my gosh, schools are going to get hit by this, and they're not going to know how to handle it.
No.
What are the options? So mine really lays out the options. So I can let you know when it's released if you want to help promote it so that educators can see where they can go for resources.
Fantastic. Yes, please do. Did you see the article that David Wright put out for schools as well?
Is it the one you posted on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah.
I found that a little confusing.
Okay.
The way that it was put out. So my structure is very different.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that was the result of some very sort of early initial testing. They'd taken a look at some of the well-known filtering software that schools use. I think, as far as I can recall, mainly sort of popular for UK schools, although some of those suppliers have also got reasonable market share, I think, in the US. They were mainly just doing some initial testing to see which ones were impacted, which ones weren't.
Okay. Maybe I'm referring to the wrong blog, though. There was one you posted to LinkedIn that didn't go into tools, and I had already written mine. I wrote it a couple of weeks ago, but I've had it in review cycles. So maybe I need to see the one you're referring to, because mine also goes into very specific tools and what works, what doesn't work, and why. But I think it's a simpler take for, an audience that is not necessarily going to be as technical, right? Like I had to talk to a head of school about this, who's the person who implements this stuff. His specialty isn't IT.
Yes.
So yeah, I can send you mine as a preview in case you have comments. But if you have that other one as well, that might, maybe there's some overlap.
What I will do when Michael joins us and is talking, so that I don't need to try and multitask really badly, I will post into the chat a link to the thing that I'm thinking of, which I can't remember if I posted it on LinkedIn or not off the top of my head. So I'll put it in the chat, so you'll see that in a few minutes. As I say, whilst Michael's talking, I'll pop it in, so you can see. but yeah, I look forward to seeing yours as well. It'd be interesting to see what conclusions you drew, not least of which, because my experience of schools IT people on the whole is like the person you've evidently spoke to, they're not hugely IT literate. Despite, I know when I first raised the topic of ECH and schools at the ITF in Vienna, I can't remember who it was. Someone told me that they provided IT support to a school on a voluntary basis, therefore it was fine. But the ITF personally supporting individual schools is especially scalable, certainly not on a global basis. In any case, but yeah. So yeah, as I say, I'll share that shortly, and then I look forward to seeing yours as well, which I'm sure is very thoughtful.
Thank you. Well, the reviewers helped for sure, as always, right?
Yes, I'm sure. So Paul, for example, would have had an opinion on stuff, but he certainly does on ECH. That's for sure.
This is something. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, right. Let me just pick up on a couple of other things, and then I'll pause. Because I see Michael has just joined, which is fantastic. So just quickly scanning through. Second bullet point on this one. That University of Michigan Flint talked about a partnership they just established to develop AI technologies targeted at improving internet safety, particular for vulnerable populations like children and the elderly. And they talk about the use of AI to block access to harmful content, etc., and specifically in an educational and work setting. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of that, since keep talking about AI in different contexts. And certainly at the last RSA conference, for example, that was certainly a strong theme of the week earlier this year. So I'm intrigued on that one, so hence popping it in. Other stuff, bottom of the screen, the Octo2 sort of malware family domain tools have done some analysis from the article, sort of building on previous work done by InfoBlocks, just looking at trying to identify domains that the Octo2 malware family uses, which was interesting and good to see that they were working or collaborating, at least in some sense, with InfoBlocks on that. And then final couple I'll highlight, and then I'll pause, and Michael can jump in with the more interesting stuff. There's the launch of Google of a data sharing initiative to fight fraud, which initial partners, the Global Anti-Scam Alliance and also the DNS Research Federation. It's a new project. I'm sure there'll be more detail coming along in due course, and I'll certainly have a discussion with friends at the DNS Research Federation about that, to see what early information can be shared on it, because it looks interesting, and it's again good to see some collaboration in this general space. And then so just final two, Apricot, they said that they were going to relocate from Dakar because of security safety concerns, and they've now confirmed it's going to be Malaysia instead. That's the middle of the screen. And then bottom of the screen, something which we'll come back to in a couple of weeks' time. The final agenda for the ITF meeting in Dublin is now published. And as I say, in 2 calls' time, I'll run through things that have caught my eye that look interesting on that, and hopefully anyone else that's had a chance to look at it by then will do likewise, so we can sort of crowdsource stuff of interest on the ITF agenda. Right, but without further ado, let me stop sharing this screen. Michael, welcome. You appear in your car, not library.
Yeah. So what happens is I am at the library. Unfortunately, it's a national holiday, so the library is closed, but their high-speed internet is available. So doing high-speed internet from the parking lot of the library. There you go.
Fantastic. Right. So do you want me to share the slides and drive them for you?
Please, yeah, that would help. Yes.
Yeah, I think in the circumstances, it's probably the least I can do, Michael. So, okay, right. So the slides should be on screen now, I hope. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you. So please take it away.
Thanks. So thank you, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me back to speak about a topic that I've been rather passionate about over the last couple of years. NIS2 is the European Cybersecurity Directive, and I've been following this since it was originally proposed back in 2020. Now, one of the reasons I followed NIS2 so closely is because, in my professional opinion, it is probably one of the most impactful pieces of national legislation that I have seen on the broader domain name industry. I put it on par with the U.S. Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act and the European GDPR. I would encourage those that are interested in taking a deep dive into the actual text of NIS2 to re-listen to the original broadcast that I did with Andrew back in May earlier this year. Now, if you could go to the next slide, Andrew, please. For the benefit of those that were not able to attend the May presentation or may not be that familiar with NIS2, allow me to give a quick recap. So NIS2 is the European Network and Information Security Act. Now, this particular piece of legislation is a directive as opposed to a regulation, and that distinction is important. Regulations such as the GDPR are uniform across all member states, whereas directives provide the objective and goals of the legislation, and then member states have some flexibility in how they go about achieving those objectives. So there tends to be some potential deviations, and this is basically done through transposition. Now, NIS2 is to go into effect October 18th. Unfortunately, only a handful of member states have actually been able to transpose NIS2 into the respective national laws. The last time I checked last week before Hurricane Milton, the member states that had successfully transposed their law, according to my records, were Belgium, Croatia, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, the vast majority of other member states have different draft proposals under consideration, but it appears that the vast majority of NIS2 implementations will likely be taking place early in 2025. So, if let me see here. So again, the purpose of NIS2 here, the objective was to provide a high common level of cybersecurity across the EU. And the reason they did this was NIS1 did not necessarily achieve the uniformity that they were looking for. So some of what you would see in NIS2 is a higher degree of specificity. So it didn't go to a regulation, but there definitely is a lot more guidance. Now, with regard to the scope of NIS2, there are two annexes attached. Next slide, please, Andrew. So in the two annexes, Annex 1 is called Sectors of High Criticality, and Annex 2 is Other Critical Sectors. Now, the Annex 1 are the ones that are most important, and as you can see here, there are a wide range of sectors that are covered, but the one that is most impactful and relevant to this group's attention is the digital infrastructure. Within digital infrastructure, TLD named registries were specifically enumerated as a sector of high criticality. In addition, as I had mentioned in my previous presentation, not only were TLD named registries included, but those entities providing domain name registration services were also included within the context of Article 28, which dealt with the accuracy and access to domain name registration data. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's been interesting is the original NIS2 was adopted in late, I think it was late November 2022. It was then published in early 2023. So over the last, say, 12 to 18 months, there have been a lot of discussions within the broader internet community about how NIS2 was going to impact the broader ecosystem. And as sort of evident by the title of this slide, I have kind of seen a dichotomy. I have seen a lot of European CCTLD managers that have actively have actively engaged in modifying their business practices and rules in how they are going to do this. A number of CCTLD managers have engaged in outreach with their registrar and channel partners to collaboratively figure out how they were going to go about complying with this. On the flip side, however, if you look at most GTLD registries and registrars, I would say they have been less proactive, and perhaps the best word I would use would be denial. And I know that is a little critical, but I think if you look at the two correspondences which I cited here, ICANN.org and the registrar stakeholder group, both of them sent NIS2 communications, and the overall thrust of the communications is all is well. We have this under control under existing ICANN policies. You know, nothing to see here. Now, one of the early sessions after the adoption of NIS2, there was a session held at the annual meeting last year in Hamburg. It was a day zero event, and ECO put on a phenomenal presentation. The recording is available, and it's a good reference piece because there were some members from the individual national regulators as well as the commission that were sharing their insight, and it was really interesting to see what they were thinking last year and actually what their recommendations that were just released last month. So it's an interesting historical perspective to think of what they were thinking, what they were hearing from multiple sides, and then what they concluded. So that is a good event. But one of the things that really caught my attention, it was towards the end. It was one of the, I believe it was one of the representatives from GoDaddy at the end of the session said, yeah, this is really helpful, but we really don't think this is going to be directly impacting our day-to-day businesses. And that really left me scratching my head because I just did not see how that was possible given the particular text of NIS2. So that was kind of the inspiration of a white paper, or perhaps labor of love is the best. Next slide, please. And so what happens is I actually decided what started off as a short paper turned into a 20-page single-spaced thesis on looking at that very topic. Was NIS2 needed, or did ICANN's existing policies adequately address the situation? And what you see on the screen is I decided to register the domain name. ICANN's definition of accuracy is a joke.com. And I did that using fictitious information. Rocky, the fictional character from the Rocky series portrayed by Sylvester Stallone, I registered that with a disposable email account with a prepaid credit card in all of about 10 minutes. And the point there in the paper is I actually detailed all of the fictitious information that I created. I displayed it. And what I basically said is, under ICANN's current definition, what I have provided here is quote unquote accurate. So that was kind of the point where I said, I respectfully disagreed with a lot of my counterparts within the ICANN uh, GTLD community and said, "Hey, something needs to be done here." So for those that are interested, there's a link to the article on Circle ID. And I was actually encouraged because a number of the recommendations and points that I did made actually were incorporated into the cooperation group's final recommendation. In this paper as well, one of the things I did was I actually worked with 5 European CCTLDs. There was DNS Belgium, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then Germany. So I believe those were the 5. And what I did is, in the paper, I actually detailed what their current practices were and how they were going to change them in light of NIS2. And the idea here was to basically provide a best practices guide or a reference point for other TLDs, not only European TLDs, but all TLDs, because as people may recall, one of the aspects of NIS2 is there is an extraterritorial provision, very similar to the GDPR. So if you are a non-European registry or registrar doing business in the European Union, you are therefore potentially impacted and are required to comply with the requirements in NIS2. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, there was a cooperation group established. This was specifically called for in one of the articles of the NIS2, and the idea of the cooperation group was to establish a group of experts that would identify best practices. It was recognized, particularly in the area those in connection with Article 28. There wasn't a lot of uniformity there, and they really wanted to try to harmonize best practices. And there were basically 2 work streams that were established. Finn Peterson, who participates, he's a GAC rep from Denmark. He was the chair of these 2 particular task force, and those task force dealt. The first one was on accuracy. The second one was on access to information. And approximately about a month ago, the cooperation group released their recommendations. You see the cover page from that. If you go to the URL on the screen, that is the URL for the cooperation group. And this has a compilation of all the different data resources that they have released and compiled over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is this is an incredibly important document, and what I have seen is those member states that are actually in the process of transposing and those that have already transposed their law, many of those recommendations actually align with what is in this paper, and it is incredibly an easy read. It's a 6-page document. Now, what I've done here over the next couple of slides is I have tried to highlight some of the more key aspects that I think are most relevant. So just to begin with, the document acknowledges that the cooperation group does not have the ability to legally bind, but what they do have the ability is to provide advisory guidelines that can be referenced by individual member states and their regulatory bodies. Now, not surprisingly, what they did is they provided definitions on syntactical validations and operational verifications. These actually, in fact, align with ICANN's definitions of best practices as far as the structure of email, telephones, addresses, stuff like that. So that was in and of itself not controversial and largely expected. What was interesting, though, however, is they actually provided some insight regarding identity verification. And here they said that, this is an exact quote, identity verification includes collection and validation of information about a registrant, such as an ID, to ensure that the registrant is who they say they are. And that was actually quite powerful. For those that may know, I previously served as a chair of ICANN's accuracy scoping group, and unfortunately, that group was unable to, if you will, reach consensus on what a definition of accuracy was, aside from what was already contained in the existing ICANN RRA. So to me, this was something important. And as I noted back in May, and I'll note here again, I do think the work that the European Union is doing now in connection with EIDAS and the European Digital Wallet, that to me, I think is something that will have an impact on the work that the cooperation group does. And there was even references in the original NIST 2 document, as well as this, referencing digital identification. Next slide, please. So here was something that is interesting. And those that may be familiar with ICANN's requirements, an ICANN accredited registrar under their current registrar accreditation agreement is required to validate the operation of either the email or the telephone. It's either or. And as I explained when I registered the domain name, ICANN's definition of accuracy is a joke. I used a disposable Proton email address to meet the operational email requirements. What is contained in these recommendations and was cited in the white paper is that the recommendation should include both email and telephone, both syntactical and operational, and that needs to happen not only at the point of initial registration, but also renewal. So that is not an insignificant change. And I think it probably is overall is a positive change. Regarding the renewal every year, you know, I think it's on total, this is a good thing. Now, the other important aspect, and this goes to touch with the identity verification, as you will see in the white paper where I talked about those 5 CCTLD managers, there was no one cookie cutter approach to how registrant verification was done. There was a variation. And what you see here by the cooperation group, I think, is reflecting that diversity of business models or business approaches. So what they said here is that every domain name registration, whether a new or renewal, requires, quote, a risk-based approach is used in the procedure for verification of the name of the registrant. And again, just in the interest of time here, how that is done, there are a number of different indicia that different registries use. Some of them machine learning, AI, there are a number of different things. But one of the things that is I see a clear trend among a growing number of European CCTLD managers is they are proactively looking at the information that they are getting, and they are flagging for further verifications, anomalous domain name registrations. And again, this is beyond, much broader than, if you will, ICANN's incredible narrow remit under DNS abuse. So again, here, there's some further clarification. I won't read it here, but for those that are interested, I would really encourage you to read this document. It is really powerful, and I think it is going to go a long way towards helping clean up a lot of the stuff that went dark. One of the other things that is important, and I almost forgot that, under when ICANN was doing their policy development work, there was some initial recommendations about trying to bifurcate the distinction between a natural person or a legal person. And the original thinking within the group is the GDPR only seeks to protect PII. And unfortunately, because a lot of the contracting parties made the argument of, well, there could be some commingled PII in with the legal entities, and we don't know how to go about vetting it. Therefore, let's just err on the side of caution and just basically outlaw or basically allow all who is a lot of those who is fields to go dark. Here, however, with NIS2, the legislation is very clear. With regard to legal entities, there is the required disclosure of that information. Now, as Thomas Rickard has noted, there is a caveat about not disclosing PII. I know him and I have gone back and forth on this. I know he was recently saying that perhaps a domain name such as CEO at domain.tld, that in and of itself, potentially, that even though it's a role account, that potentially could be conceived as PII. I find that I personally find that a stretch. But it is very clear if you look at the existing best practices of European CCTLDs, they are disclosing, a growing number of them are disclosing the email associated with legal entities. And I think this is probably going to be one of the biggest things that ICANN GTLD registries and registrars struggle with. Next slide, please. So, notwithstanding all of the great work that the cooperation group did in that recommendation document, when I got done reading it, there was one thing that jumped out at me that I was expecting to have some clarity on that I was kind of left with a to be determined. And this dealt with a specific piece of text in Article 28. And that text, which I quoted here, states, TLD name registries and entities providing domain name registration services to collect and maintain accurate and complete domain name registration data, and here's the key word, in a dedicated database. Now, what is really interesting is European CCTLD managers continue to generally operate thick registries, meaning they have the authoritative copy of all of the information associated with this. This is unlike VeriSign, which since the beginning of the since the beginning has always operated what we would call a thin registry, meaning all they know is I have a domain name, I have some minimum technical data about that domain name, and I have the registrar with who that domain name is sponsored. So that has kind of been a back and forth, and there was originally an ICANN consensus policy that said all registries should be thick. That was basically rescinded as part of the GDPR work. Now, what has happened over the last couple of months is almost every major GTLD registry has announced that they are going thin. So this has actually led to an interesting, I'll call it a conundrum here. How can there be a dedicated database if you are thin? Now, Thomas Rickard and a lot of the ECO have been talking about coming up with an agreement whereby registries will cooperate and agree to defer that collection solely to the registrars. I find that to have a number of challenges. Perhaps the biggest challenge deals with the identity verification. Every best practice by CCTLD managers generally involves looking at the totality of the information to identify suspect or potentially fraudulent registrations. I do not know how a thin registry will be able to undertake that undertake that step under NIS2 if all they have is a thin data set. So this to me is something that I was hoping to see some guidance, but I actually think they probably did the right thing. And allow NIS2 to be implemented. Let's see what happens. And then the cooperation group hopefully will provide some further guidance. Next slide, please. And to kind of highlight this divergence of viewpoints, I would point to two articles, both by people I know and respect. Thomas Rickert gave the viewpoint in the article Demystifying Article 28, where he argued that he thought that having the two databases, one by the registry and one by the registrar, would be inconsistent with the wording. Dean Marks, however, gave an alternate viewpoint. I think both of these authors, friends and colleagues, make valid points on both of their viewpoints. However, I think tend to align more with where Dean is going. And part of the most compelling reason for that is the fact that if you look at what European registries are doing, that is what they do. They have a single compiled thick database. So if you were to adopt the viewpoint of Thomas, that would almost therefore justify European CCTLD managers going thin. And that to me would not be the right thing to do, because that would impede their ability to do all of their abuse detection, identity verification, checking and monitoring. So again, this is something that I think will bear further follow-up and monitoring. I think we're almost at the end. Next slide. So for those that are still interested in going deeper down the NIS2 rabbit hole, what I would encourage you to do is the Belgian government, in my opinion, has really knocked it out of the park. Their Center for Cybersecurity, Belgium, if you go to their website, they have a whole compilation of material on NIS2, and they've actually launched what they call a Safe on Web at Work initiative. And if you go there, they have a number of resources that allow an individual, for companies, to identify, am I within scope, out of scope, a lot of excellent self-help tools. And for those that are interested, that is a good place to start. Hopefully, as other member states move forward with transposing to the national laws, there will be similar resources available. But right now, really been impressed by what they've done. They've had a number of webinars. I even showed up at one of them, and in one of the breakout groups was asking a number of questions, and they were incredibly super helpful. So, as I said, I think this I think is truly going to be a transformational piece of legislation that will have a lasting impact on the overall domain name ecosystem in a positive light. That again is my opinion, and there we go. So I think we are done. And does anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns before I still have a little battery left, but there we go. So let's there we go.
Thanks. That's really good as always, Michael. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And if so, raise your virtual hand if you can find the tool under React, or the React icon, or pop something in the chat if that's easier. Just while people are thinking, I think I agree with what I think we're saying, Michael, about the sort of thick registry sort of requirement, seemingly more consistent with the sort of NIS2. And it'd be interesting for those organizations, perhaps not sort of specifically based in Europe, but actively selling in Europe, such as VeriSign, for example, whether and how they change anything that they are doing. I put in the chat a link to the DNS Research Federation's Article 28 tracker, which I think the last time I checked, which was last weekend, virtually no countries, I think there were 2 or 3 that had completed that exercise. Most it was ongoing. 1, possibly 2 have yet to start, which is surprising given the looming deadline. I thought they'd at least have started by now, even if they hadn't finished. So I don't know how quickly, how often that's updated, but it seemed like there was a lot of work in progress still.
Just on that point, and as I said, I think Dean and Thomas both have made compelling statements. Where I think there is a possibility to potentially thread the needle, VeriSign as a thin registry did this to comply with Chinese real name verification. So China has a similar corresponding law or a similar requirements regarding registrant verification. Now, what VeriSign did, and you can read this in their RCEPs that they filed with ICANN, is they included another pointer in their database that pointed to the authoritative or the verified data of that registrant. So they themselves did not possess it. They were basically saying, here is a pointer to someone who has that information that can go ahead and validate it. Now, with regard to the registrant, what was interesting, and this was something under the Belgian law as well, and I've spoken. When you read Article 28 and it talks about TLD named registries and not or, right? So to me, those registries that do want to go thin, I think they are probably going to have to engage in a lot more, if you will, mitigation to identify suspect registrations. And I don't know how they are going to do that. Does that mean they have to hold the data? They do maybe not have to hold the data, but they may have to process the data to identify. Because if you only have a data set of one registrar, the way you pick up trends is by looking at the entire data set. Not by you want to look through a telescope, not a microscope, to identify anomalous detections. So that to me, I think is, as I said, I was hoping for some additional clarity, did not get it, but I think the cooperation group probably did the right thing. Let's see what the European CCTLDs do. Let's see what's administered. Let's see how NIS2 or EIDAS rolls out, the European wallet. I don't think the work of the cooperation group is static. I think it's dynamic, and it even talks about evolving best practices. So I don't view this as the end, but more the beginning of a journey.
Yeah. Agreed. I guess until some of this is actually tested in court at some future point, it's just opinions, isn't it? So it'll be interesting to see when it gets as far as regulators doing stuff proactively. But I think we're a little way off from that just yet. Okay, last chance for anyone with any immediate questions. There's a lot to absorb there, packed into a very short space of time, which is quite impressive, Michael, to cover that in less than, about half an hour. You covered a lot of ground there. Well, I've put a link to the previous session in the chat, as you mentioned that, back in May. It doesn't seem that long ago. It's getting on for 6 months ago, so that was good to.
So what we may want to do, Andrew, is we'll finish the trilogy in maybe another 12 months, after we've seen all of the member states transpose their law, all the established best practices, and maybe in 12 to 18 months we may have our first enforcement action. So there you go. So that may will complete the NIS2 trilogy in due course.
That makes good sense. All the best things come in trilogies, I think. So, oh, I see Eric has got a question. Did you want to come in, Eric?
Yeah, hey there. That great presentation. Thank you very much for keeping your head wrapped around this. Do you see anything happening in the next in a year or so for as a reaction from ICANN in a positive way to help registrars or registries address how things might be changing?
To be determined. So the glass half full. The registrar stakeholder group announced a listening session as part of the upcoming ICANN meeting in Istanbul regarding what does data accuracy mean to you. And I found that a little interesting because the cooperation group has specifically defined accuracy. So it would really, I think it would not be good if ICANN started to come up with a definition that diverges from what I would say the Europeans and, and I would also say the Chinese real name verification has continued to evolve. There is a clear trend if one looks back over the last 25 years of what is expected. I personally think that this is an opportunity, right? If in, I'll give you a case in point. There's been a number of sessions that registrars and registries have been participating on, although these generally have been closed sessions for security reasons. They have been discussing the issue of excessive credit card chargebacks, right? So to me, if we can sit there and identify problematic registrations before the point of sale, that's a good thing, because then we're minimizing credit card chargebacks, we're minimizing fraud. So to me, I think that there is a path where ICANN could hopefully work with registrars and registries and view this as an opportunity as opposed to a burden. That's, I would say that is my kind of glass half full. And I guess just building on top of that, just looking at a lot of the stuff that has been taking place with the ITIS and a number of different initiatives, I actually think there's the ability for the DNS to be the part of the infrastructure that powers some of these new digital identity solutions, whether it's for individuals, whether it's for businesses, whether it's for machines, right? Know your customer, know your machine. This to me, I think are all opportunities. And Fraunhofer in Germany has actually done a lot of work where they have tried to use the DNS as an underpinning infrastructure for some of these identity solutions. So to me, I'm going to try to remain glass half full. I'll let you know after the annual meeting in Istanbul next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question as well. Okay, look, we conscious of the time. I just want to cover a couple of last things. So, Michael, really appreciate managing to do that from the car park on a public holiday on the way home from the airport. That's I think that's a good dedication to get that done. So really appreciate your time today. That was fantastic.
Keep up the good work, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right, let me just quickly wrap up, and this will be quick because I am looking at the time. So 2 minutes. I think we've sort of finished running through some of the news. Those of you on the mail list can read through the rest at your leisure. As always, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well, which I won't have time to talk about, but there's other things which caught my eye through this week. Just to highlight, there's a few deadlines coming up this week, such as if you want to join the Cyber Resilience Act expert group. This is for the EU. There's a deadline a couple of days or so from now for that. Similarly, if you want, if I don't think anyone on this call is a journalist in the Global South, but if you were and wanted support to go to the IGF in Riyadh in December, you got till the end of this week to apply for that. Similarly, for lightning talks at RIPE. And then next Monday is the cutoff for internet drafts prior to the data tracker closing in advance of the ITF 121 meeting, and that's also the deadline to register at the early as opposed to the standard rate. So reminder, it goes up after I think 23:59 UTC on Monday. So if you're planning to register either online or in person, you can save an amount of money by registering before end of next Monday. And it's not that long now for the deadline for lightning talks for OARC 43 as well. We've got to the 27th, so a couple of weeks for that, and then some other stuff with longer timeline which we won't talk about. And then finally, a few things this week. You got the DNS for EU stakeholder group tomorrow afternoon European time, so register for that if you haven't already done so. The EU's high level group on internet governance meets next Wednesday morning European time. If you want to register for that and haven't got a link, message me and I'll send you something directly on that. And also the Internet Governance Project from the University of Georgia, I think it is, have got their annual conference in Atlanta this week, talking about whether AI needs governance. So various things this week, and then we're not that far from OARC 43, RIPE 89, of course, ITF 121, all coming up over the next few weeks. And finally, I will do a call next week, just looking at the agenda for OARC 43 and RIPE 89, and then the week after looking at the ITF 121 agenda. If you are attending RIPE in person in Prague and want to join me for that call, please do so, or we can always meet afterwards for a beer on the Monday evening. Similarly, I won't do a call the week of ITF, but again, we can meet in Dublin on the Monday evening as well. But with that in mind, we've timed out, so thank you everyone for your attention. Have a fantastic week and look forward to catching up next week to talk about the OARC and RIPE agendas. So talk to you all then. Have a great week.
Thank you.